The man who hired hitmen to kill his wife is currently trying to clear his name.
Evidence led to 3 suspects in the murder of a high-profile doctor.
This case was about the perfect marriage, the perfect friendship.
Is found on her kitchen floor, dead.
Arrived at Southwest Florida International Airport just before midnight on Sunday, June 28, 2015. Security cameras caught her walking through the terminal alone, pulling her small suitcase behind her phone pressed to her ear. She was smiling. She had no idea that within the hour, 2 men would be waiting for her inside her own home. She had no idea she would never see her daughters again. Her full name was Teresa Ann Grace Tottenham Sivers. She was 46 years old. Born in Darby, Connecticut in November 1968, she'd been raised by a single mother after her parents separated when she was only a month old. From the very beginning, Teresa's life had been shaped by determination and an unshakable belief that she could build something better than what she'd been given. By 6th grade, she already knew what she wanted to be, a doctor. Not because it sounded impressive or because someone told her she should, but because she genuinely wanted to help people. Her mother, Mary Ann, used to joke that Teresa never settled for anything less than perfection. If she brought home a test with a 98, she'd spend the evening figuring out where those 2 points went. An A- wasn't acceptable. It was a failure to be corrected. Her family started calling her Mother Teresa when she was still a teenager. Not because she was preachy or self-righteous, but because she couldn't stop herself from helping everyone around her. A neighbor needed a ride. Teresa drove them. A friend was struggling with homework. Teresa stayed up tutoring them until they understood. She gave and gave and gave, never once considering that not everyone would return that generosity. After high school, she pursued her dream with the same relentless focus she'd applied to everything else. She enrolled in medical school at Ross University, one of the most rigorous programs in the Caribbean. She graduated with honors in internal medicine. She was brilliant. Everyone who knew her said so. But brilliance wasn't enough for Teresa. She wanted to do more than treat symptoms. She wanted to understand the whole person, body, and spirit. Her first marriage didn't last. She rarely talked about it, and those who knew her said she simply moved forward without looking back. That was Teresa's way. No dwelling, no self-pity, just the next step. Then in 2002, at a medical conference in Florida, she met a nurse named Mark Sivers. He was the brother of one of her friends. Tall, charismatic, easy to talk to. He seemed steady, dependable. He made her laugh. By 2003, they were married. Friends described them as the kind of couple that looked perfect from the outside. Mark left his nursing career to help Teresa build something bigger. Together, they opened Restorative Health and Healing Center in Estero, Florida, a holistic medical practice that focused on treating patients as whole human beings rather than collections of symptoms. Teresa handled patient care. Mark managed the office and took care of their 2 daughters, Josephine and Carmela. Holistic medicine wasn't popular with everyone. Some in the traditional medical community dismissed it as pseudoscience, but Teresa didn't care what the skeptics said. She believed in what she was doing, and her patients believed in her. Many of them had come to her after conventional medicine had failed them. They trusted her because she genuinely listened. She spent time with them. She remembered their names, their stories, their fears. "We as doctors are treating this physical body that we can touch," she once said in an interview. "But there's a whole other part of our body. If you break us down to that smallest level, even beyond the cell, we are atoms and molecules. And guess what? That has energy, and it vibrates and it moves. And sometimes when you have an imbalance of that energy, just like if you got a clogged artery and you can't get the blood flow to go through, you can have problems in your physical body because of that energy flow." She wasn't just passionate about her work. She was evangelical about it. She wanted to bring holistic medicine to the masses. She dreamed of having her own television show one day, a platform where she could reach people beyond the walls of her clinic. She wanted to change the way the world thought about health and healing. Her patients adored her. One former patient, Marion Ziegler McAfee, said years later that Teresa was like the Oprah Winfrey of Florida. That's how beloved she was in her community. That's how much people trusted her. But Teresa's life wasn't perfect, even if it looked that way from the outside. Running a medical practice is exhausting. Being a mother to 2 young girls is exhausting. Trying to do both while also being a wife and maintaining a public image as a wellness expert, that takes a toll. Neighbors later told investigators they'd heard arguing coming from the Sivers home. Not screaming matches, but the kind of tense, low conversations that people have when they're trying not to let their children hear. The kind of arguing that happens when 2 people are exhausted, stressed about money, and slowly realizing they want different things from life. Teresa was the face of the practice. Mark was the support, and somewhere along the way, that dynamic had started to feel unbalanced. Teresa was the star. Mark was in the background. For a while, that seemed fine, but over time, cracks started to show. Still, to everyone who saw them in public, they seemed fine. They showed up at their daughter's school events together. They smiled in family photos. They went to church. They took vacations. In June 2015, they planned a trip to New York to celebrate Mary Ann's birthday. It was supposed to be a family vacation. Teresa, Mark, and their 2 daughters. A chance to get away from Florida, away from the stress of the practice, and just be together. But Teresa had patients scheduled for Monday morning. She couldn't leave them hanging, so the plan changed. The family would fly to New York together, spend the weekend celebrating, and then Teresa would fly home alone on Sunday night while Mark and the girls stayed behind to finish the vacation. Before they left, Mark's mother had been asked to stop by the house each day to take care of the dogs. She had the security code. Every morning she'd come in, turn off the alarm, feed the dogs, and then reset the alarm before leaving. It was a simple routine, nothing complicated. Except on Saturday, June 27th, something went wrong. The alarm wouldn't set properly. Mark's mother called him, confused. Mark told her not to worry about it. Teresa would be home the next day anyway. Teresa didn't know about the alarm malfunction. She was in New York, surrounded by family, celebrating her mother's birthday. She posted photos on social media. She smiled. She laughed. She had no reason to think anything was wrong back home. On Sunday evening, she said goodbye to Mark and her daughters. She hugged them, told them she loved them, promised she'd see them in a few days when they got back. Then she drove to the airport, boarded her flight, and headed home to Florida. Security footage shows her landing at Southwest Florida International Airport at 11:19 p.m. on Sunday, June 28, 2015. She walked through the terminal alone, pulling her small black suitcase behind her. She was on her phone, probably calling Mark to let him know she'd landed safely. She was smiling. She walked to the parking lot, got into her car, and drove home to Bonita Springs. It was late. The streets were quiet. She was probably thinking about the patients she'd see in the morning. Maybe she was thinking about her daughters, missing them already. Maybe she was just tired and looking forward to sleeping in her own bed. She pulled into her driveway, grabbed her suitcase, unlocked the door. The alarm didn't go off. She stepped inside, and everything changed. Mark Sivers was born in Missouri. He grew up in a working-class family in a part of the state where everyone knew everyone else's business. He was smart enough, charming enough, good-looking enough. The kind of guy who could talk his way into almost anything. He became a nurse, which surprised some people who knew him. Nursing requires patience, empathy, and the ability to put other people's needs before your own. Mark could perform those qualities when he needed to. But those who knew him well said there was always something slightly performative about his kindness, like he was playing a role. When he met Teresa in 2002, he saw something he wanted. She was brilliant, driven, successful. She had a vision for her life and the determination to make it happen. Mark positioned himself as her partner, her support system, the person who would help her build her dream. And for a while, that's exactly what he did. But by 2015, something had shifted. Teresa's practice was thriving. Her reputation was growing. She was becoming well known in Southwest Florida as a doctor who could help people when traditional medicine had failed them. She was the star. Mark was the office manager, the guy who handled scheduling and insurance paperwork while his wife changed lives. It's hard to know exactly when Mark started to resent her success. Maybe it was gradual, maybe it happened all at once, but people close to the couple noticed changes. Mark became more controlling. He monitored Teresa's phone. He questioned where she was going and who she was with. He accused her of things she hadn't done. Neighbors reported hearing arguments. Not loud, explosive fights, but tense, bitter conversations that seeped through walls late at night. The kind of arguments that happen when two people have stopped seeing each other as partners and started seeing each other as obstacles. Mark was worried about money. The practice was doing well, but running a medical office is expensive. There were staff salaries, insurance, equipment, rent, and Mark had developed expensive habits. He liked nice things. He wanted to maintain a certain lifestyle, but Teresa controlled the finances. She made the decisions, and Mark hated that. By early 2015, Mark had become convinced that Teresa was planning to leave him. There's no evidence she'd actually filed for divorce or even consulted a lawyer. But in Mark's mind, it was inevitable. And if she left, she'd take the girls with her. He was certain of that. She was the successful doctor. He was the office manager. No judge would give him custody. Mark couldn't afford to fight her. He didn't have the money for a prolonged legal battle. And even if he did, he'd probably lose. So somewhere in his mind, a different solution started to take shape, a solution that would solve all of his problems at once. In Missouri, more than 1,000 miles away, Curtis Wainwright Jr. was living a very different kind of life. Curtis had known Mark since they were kids. They'd grown up together, gone to the same schools, gotten into the same kinds of trouble. Curtis was the kind of guy who always seemed to be on the edge of something illegal. He'd been connected to a missing person case back in 1996, a preacher named Ronnie Poland who disappeared and was never found. Curtis was never charged, but people who knew him had their suspicions. By 2011, Curtis had done time in prison on drug charges. He was the kind of person who knew how to survive in the gray areas of the law. He was smart with computers, almost obsessively so. Former classmates said he was one of the smartest people they'd ever met when it came to technology. He understood systems, how they worked, how to manipulate them. He and Mark had stayed in touch over the years, not constantly, but enough to maintain the friendship. Mark would visit Missouri when he could. They'd go to weddings together. They'd catch up. And somewhere along the way, Mark must have recognized something useful in Curtis, something dangerous. Curtis looked remarkably similar to Mark. Same build, same facial structure, same mannerisms. People who saw them together often did a double take. It was uncanny, and Curtis seemed to lean into it. In more recent years, he'd started styling himself to look even more like Mark. Same haircut, same glasses, like he was trying to become his friend's doppelganger. In early 2015, Mark attended Curtis's wedding in Missouri. While he was there, Mark confided in his old friend. He told him about his marriage problems. He told him Teresa was going to leave and take the girls. He told him he couldn't let that happen. According to Curtis's later testimony, Mark said there was only one solution. Teresa had to die. At first, Curtis thought he was joking, but Mark wasn't joking. He was serious, desperate, and he was willing to pay. Teresa had multiple life insurance policies. If she died, Mark would receive $4.43 million. He promised Curtis $100,000 to make it happen. Curtis agreed. Think about that for a moment. A childhood friendship decades old, and it took one conversation for Curtis to agree to murder his friend's wife. No hesitation, no moral struggle, just a cold calculation. $100,000 in exchange for a human life. But Curtis didn't plan to do it alone. He knew someone else, someone even more dangerous than himself. Jimmy Ray Rogers was a career criminal. He'd been in and out of prison for years. Drugs, theft, assault. He had a nickname that everyone who knew him used, the Hammer. Some people said he gave himself that nickname to sound tougher. Others said he earned it because a hammer was his weapon of choice. Either way, it was the name people knew him by. Curtis and Jimmy had served time together. They knew how the other operated. Curtis trusted Jimmy to do what needed to be done and keep his mouth shut. More importantly, Jimmy needed money. He was desperate, broke, and willing to do almost anything to get out from under his debts. Curtis approached Jimmy with a proposition. A job in Florida, quick trip, good money. He didn't tell Jimmy all the details at first, just enough to get him interested. Jimmy agreed. On the morning of Saturday, June 27, 2015, Curtis picked up a rental car in Hillsborough, Missouri. Then he drove to Jimmy's place and picked him up. They entered an address into the GPS system. Bonita Springs, Florida, more than 1,100 miles away. They packed light. Curtis brought his computer skills, his knowledge of alarm systems, his ability to think through problems. Jimmy brought a hammer. They drove south, all day, all night, 17 hours on the road with one destination in mind. They stopped at gas stations along the way. Security cameras caught them on surveillance footage. Two men in a rental car buying snacks, filling up the tank, acting like they were on a normal road trip, not like they were driving toward a murder. They arrived in Bonita Springs around 6:00 a.m. on Sunday morning, June 28th. The Sivers house was quiet. The family was still in New York. Curtis knew that. Mark had told him everything. The layout of the house, the security code, when Teresa would be home, when she'd be alone. They parked nearby. Curtis entered the house using the security code Mark had provided. He disabled the alarm. Then they left. They weren't ready yet. They had things to buy first. They drove to a local Walmart. Security cameras captured them walking through the aisles, completely unconcerned about being seen. They purchased trash bags, black towels, black shoes, wet wipes, and a lock-picking kit. They paid cash with a $100 bill. Then they drove to a nearby beach. They sat, waited, killed time. The GPS in their rental car logged every movement, recording a digital trail neither of them fully understood they were leaving. By late afternoon, they returned to the Sivers house. They entered again using the security code. This time, they didn't leave. They sat in the house for hours, waiting, knowing Teresa would return that night, knowing she'd be alone. Back in Missouri, Mark was playing his role perfectly. He was in New York with his daughters, hundreds of miles away, surrounded by family. The perfect alibi. He called his mother and told her not to worry about the alarm. He texted Teresa. He acted like a loving husband enjoying a family vacation. He was performing, and he was good at it. In Florida, Curtis and Jimmy sat in the dark house, listening to the silence, waiting for headlights in the driveway, waiting for Teresa to come home. The Hammer sat nearby. Teresa's car pulled into the driveway at 11:43. The GPS in the rental car parked nearby recorded the exact moment. Curtis and Jimmy heard the engine cut off, heard the car door open and close, heard footsteps on the pavement. They'd been sitting in the dark for hours, waiting in silence. The house was familiar to Curtis. Mark had described every room, every corner, every potential hiding spot. Curtis knew where to stand, knew where Teresa would walk when she came inside. Teresa unlocked the front door. She stepped into the foyer, pulling her small black suitcase behind her. The alarm didn't beep. That should have registered as strange, but she was tired. It had been a long day of traveling. Maybe she thought Mark's mother had forgotten to reset it. Maybe she didn't think about it at all. She walked toward the kitchen. That's when Curtis made his move. According to his later confession, he'd planned to use his hands. He was taller than Teresa, stronger. He thought he could subdue her quickly and quietly, but he brought the hammer as backup, just in case. He stepped toward her. His foot hit a dog bowl on the floor. The metal dish went flying, clattering across the tile. The noise was deafening in the quiet house. Teresa spun around. Curtis panicked. He'd lost the element of surprise. She was turning toward him, and if she saw his face clearly, if she scratched him or fought back and left evidence under her fingernails, everything would fall apart. So he swung the hammer. The first blow struck her on the side of the head. It didn't knock her out. That's what Curtis said later, that he'd expected it to knock her unconscious immediately, like in the movies. But real life doesn't work that way. Teresa staggered but stayed on her feet. She raised her hands to defend herself. She fought. Curtis hit her again, and again. Jimmy stepped forward and joined in. Two men with one hammer taking turns, striking her over and over, 17 times in total. The medical examiner would later count every single impact point on her skull. Teresa looked at Curtis through her raised arms. Blood was running down her face. She was dying and she knew it. And according to Curtis's confession, she asked one question. Why? Curtis didn't answer. He just kept swinging. When it was over, Teresa lay on the kitchen floor in a pool of her own blood. The back of her head was crushed. The hammer, the murder weapon, sat nearby, covered in blood and hair. Curtis and Jimmy stood there for a moment, catching their breath. Then they went to work. They hadn't planned this part as carefully as they should have. Curtis later admitted he'd never killed anyone before. He didn't know how much blood there would be, how much evidence they'd leave behind. They used the towels they'd bought at Walmart to wipe down surfaces. They tried to clean themselves up, but there was too much blood. It was everywhere, on the floor, on the walls, on their clothes. They grabbed their supplies and left through the garage. They got into the rental car and drove away. The GPS recorded their route. They headed north, back toward Missouri, driving through the night with more than 1,000 miles ahead of them. Somewhere along Highway 47 in rural Missouri, they stopped. Jimmy threw his cell phone out the window, piece by piece, destroying the evidence. He also threw out a blue jumpsuit he'd been wearing during the murder. It landed on the side of the highway, and weeks later, investigators would find it. Forensic analysis would match fibers from that jumpsuit to fibers found on Teresa's dress. Back in New York, Mark Sivers woke up on Monday morning. He was still with his daughter, still surrounded by Teresa's family. He acted like everything was normal. He called Teresa's phone. No answer. He called again. Still nothing. He texted her, "Hey, hope you made it home safe. Call me when you wake up." He waited an appropriate amount of time. Then he called Teresa's assistant, Sandra Hoskins, who worked at the clinic. Sandra told him Teresa hadn't shown up for her morning appointments. That wasn't like her. Teresa was never late. She never missed appointments without calling. Mark acted concerned. He called Dr. Peter, a neighbor and family friend who lived nearby. He asked Peter to go check on Teresa at the house. Dr. Peter drove to the Sivers home. The garage door was open. That was the first strange thing he noticed. He walked inside calling Teresa's name. He found her on the kitchen floor. At 9:24 a.m. on Monday, June 29th, 2015, Dr. Peter called 911. "I'm at a friend's house," he said, his voice shaking. "He's out of town and I came here to check on his wife and she's dead on the floor." The 911 operator asked him to describe what he saw. "There's a hammer at the side and she's bashed in the back of the head. She's cold. The back of her head is bashed in and there's blood everywhere." The operator kept him on the line, asking questions, trying to keep him calm. "Is she awake?" "No, she's dead on the floor. She's cold." Police arrived within minutes. They secured the scene and called in detectives. What they found inside the Sivers home made it immediately clear this was not a robbery. Nothing was missing. Teresa's purse was still there. Her jewelry was untouched. There were expensive guns in the house, completely ignored. Most shocking of all, there was a safe in the office, wide open, containing $40,000 in cash. The killer had walked right past it. This was personal. Someone had wanted Teresa Sivers dead. Someone had wanted her to suffer. Detectives looked at the scene and knew they were dealing with a murder of rage. 17 blows with a hammer. That level of violence wasn't about money or robbery. That was hatred. That was fury. That was someone who wanted Teresa to feel every single hit. But Teresa was a doctor, a healer. By all accounts, she dedicated her life to helping people. Who could possibly hate her this much? Mark received the phone call while he was still in New York. According to witnesses, his reaction seemed theatrical. He started yelling, crying, saying things like, "Oh my God, Teresa, what could I have done? If I was with you, this wouldn't have happened." He immediately booked a flight back to Florida, bringing his 2 daughters with him. Josephine was 11. Carmela was 8. They still didn't know their mother was dead. Mark hadn't told them yet. The investigation began in earnest. Detectives interviewed neighbors, friends, family members. They reviewed security footage from the airport showing Teresa's arrival. They examined the alarm system, which had mysteriously malfunctioned the day before the murder. They looked at Mark Sivers closely. The husband is always the first suspect in cases like this, but Mark had an airtight alibi. He'd been more than 1,000 miles away in New York, surrounded by family, at the exact time Teresa was murdered. There was no way he could have physically committed the crime. Still, something about his behavior bothered detectives. The grief seemed performed. The shock seemed rehearsed. When they interviewed him, he talked too much, offered too many details, acted too helpful. It was the behavior of someone trying very hard to appear innocent. But appearing guilty isn't the same as being guilty. And without evidence, Mark Sivers was just a grieving husband who'd lost his wife in a brutal home invasion. Teresa's body was taken to the medical examiner's office. The autopsy confirmed what everyone already knew: blunt force trauma to the head, 17 distinct impact points. She'd been struck with such force that her skull had fractured in multiple places. She'd fought back. Defensive wounds on her hands and arms proved that. But against 2 attackers with a hammer, she'd never had a chance. The funeral was held a few days later. Hundreds of people attended. Patients, friends, family members, colleagues. Everyone who'd ever been touched by Teresa's kindness wanted to say goodbye. Mark stood at the front of the church with his daughters, accepting condolences. He cried. He hugged people. He thanked them for coming. And standing right next to him, comforting him, acting like a grieving friend, was Curtis Wainwright Jr. Curtis had driven down from Missouri for the funeral. He stood beside Mark, placed his hand on his shoulder, whispered words of support. To everyone watching, he looked like exactly what he was supposed to be: Mark's loyal childhood friend, there to support him through the worst moment of his life. No one suspected him. Why would they? He was just a friend from out of town, just another mourner paying his respects. After the funeral, Mark went home with his daughters. He had to figure out how to tell 2 little girls that their mother was never coming back, that someone had taken her from them forever. There are bad people in the world, he told them, and bad people do bad things. He didn't tell them that he was one of those bad people, that he'd orchestrated their mother's murder, that he'd hired his best friend to kill her while he stayed safely 1,000 miles away. For nearly 2 months, the case went cold. For 8 weeks, the investigation stalled. Detectives had a crime scene full of blood, a murder weapon covered in fingerprints, and absolutely no suspects. They'd interviewed everyone close to Teresa. They'd looked at disgruntled patients, former employees, anyone who might have had a grudge. Nothing led anywhere. Then, in late August 2015, something strange happened. An airport police chief from Southern Illinois called the Lee County Sheriff's Office. He said he knew a woman who had information about the Teresa Sivers murder. Important information. Her name was Taylor Shawmaker. She was pregnant, and she was terrified of her boyfriend, Jimmy Ray Rogers. Detectives brought Taylor in for questioning. What she told them changed everything. Jimmy had confessed to her, not right away, but slowly in pieces, late at night when they were lying in bed together. He told her he'd gone to Florida with Curtis Wayne Wright. He told her they'd killed someone, a doctor, Mark's wife. At first, Taylor didn't believe him. Jimmy lied about a lot of things, but then the details started adding up. The trip to Florida that Jimmy had taken in late June. The way he'd acted when he came back paranoid, jumpy, scared. The way he'd made her drive with him along Highway 47 and throw things out the window. His cell phone, broken into pieces. A blue jumpsuit. She'd asked him how they killed the doctor. He'd made a motion with his hand, swinging downward. With a hammer, he said. Taylor knew about Jimmy's nickname. Everyone called him the Hammer. She'd always thought it was just tough guy posturing, the kind of name criminals give themselves to sound more dangerous than they are. Now she realized it might mean something worse. Detectives listened to Taylor's story and immediately began pulling records, phone records, credit card statements, rental car agreements, and that's when they found it. The digital breadcrumb trail that Curtis and Jimmy had left behind without even realizing it. On June 27, 2015, Curtis Wainwright had rented a car from Enterprise in Hillsboro, Missouri. The rental agreement listed both Curtis and Jimmy as drivers, and the car, like most modern rental cars, had a GPS system that logged every single place it went. Investigators pulled the GPS data. The route was damning. The car left Missouri on the morning of June 27th. It drove straight to Bonita Springs, Florida, arriving early on the morning of June 28th. The GPS showed the car parked near the Sivers home at 6:00 a.m. Then it showed a drive to a local Walmart, then a drive to a beach, then back to the Sivers home, where it stayed for hours. After the murder, the GPS tracked the car driving north, back toward Missouri, taking the exact route Taylor had described. Every turn, every stop, every mile, it was all there, recorded in digital memory. Detectives pulled security footage from the Walmart. There, clear as day, were Curtis Wainwright and Jimmy Ray Rogers walking through the aisles, buying trash bags, black towels, black shoes, wet wipes, a lock-picking kit. They weren't wearing masks. They weren't trying to hide. They paid with a $100 bill and walked out like they were buying supplies for a camping trip, not a murder. On August 26, 2015, nearly 2 months after Teresa's death, police arrested Jimmy Ray Rogers in Missouri. The next day, they arrested Curtis Wainwright. At a press conference, Sheriff Mike Scott stood in front of reporters and made the announcement. 2 men from Missouri had been arrested and charged with the murder of Dr. Teresa Sivers. Their names were Curtis Wainwright Jr. and Jimmy Ray Rogers. Reporter Jessica Lipscomb, who'd been covering the case from the beginning, was at that press conference. She later described the shock in the room when the sheriff said the suspects were from Missouri. Nobody had expected that. Nobody understood the connection. Then the sheriff mentioned something else. Curtis Wainwright wasn't just some random killer. He was Mark Sivers' childhood best friend. That's when everything clicked. This wasn't a random home invasion. This wasn't a robbery. This was a murder for hire. But the sheriff wasn't ready to arrest Mark. Not yet. They had Curtis and Jimmy, but they needed one of them to talk. They needed someone to confirm that Mark had been involved. For months, Curtis and Jimmy sat in separate jails, refusing to cooperate. They didn't talk to investigators. They didn't make statements. They lawyered up and stayed silent. Mark continued to play the grieving husband. He gave interviews. He talked about how much he missed Teresa. He posted tributes to her on social media. He acted like a man destroyed by grief. But behind the scenes, detectives were watching him closely. They noticed that hours after Teresa's funeral, Mark had been seen throwing computer equipment into a dumpster behind the medical office. Why would he do that? What was he trying to hide? They also noticed that while Mark had initially been cooperative, handing over his cell phone, answering questions, he'd suddenly stopped cooperating. He'd hired a lawyer. He'd refused further interviews. That wasn't the behavior of an innocent man eager to find his wife's killer. Investigators kept digging. They discovered that Teresa had 5 separate life insurance policies totaling $4.43 million. If she died, Mark would receive every penny. They discovered that Mark and Teresa's marriage had been falling apart, that Mark had been convinced Teresa was going to leave him and take the girls, that he'd told friends he couldn't afford to fight her for custody. They discovered that Curtis Wayne Wright had been at Mark's wedding, that the 2 men had stayed close over the years, that Curtis had visited Florida multiple times and had even worked on the computers at Teresa's medical office. He knew the layout of the house. He knew the security code. He knew everything because Mark had told him everything. The evidence was mounting, but they still needed Curtis or Jimmy to confess. They needed one of them to flip. In December 2015, 6 months after the murder, prosecutors made Curtis an offer. Plead guilty to second-degree murder and testify against Mark Sivers and Jimmy Rogers. In exchange, he'd get 25 years instead of life or death. Curtis took the deal. On December 10, 2015, police arrested Mark Sivers at his home. His daughters were there. They watched as officers put their father in handcuffs and led him away. In one brutal moment, those 2 little girls lost both parents. Their mother murdered. Their father arrested for ordering the killing. Teresa's mother, Mary Ann Groves, immediately filed for custody of Josephine and Carmela. Mark fought her. Even from jail, he tried to manipulate the situation, calling his own mother and pressuring her to demand custody instead. Recorded jailhouse conversations captured him strategizing, trying to control the narrative even after his arrest. In May 2016, Judge Bruce Kyle granted Mary Ann full custody of the girls. Mark's parental rights were effectively over. Curtis Wayne Wright's confession was devastating. He laid out the entire plot in detail. How Mark had approached him at the wedding in Missouri. How Mark had told him Teresa needed to die. How Mark had promised him $100,000 from the life insurance money. How he'd recruited Jimmy to help. How they'd driven to Florida, waited in the house, and killed Teresa with a hammer. Curtis admitted that he'd expected Teresa to die quickly, but she'd fought back. He described how she'd looked at him and asked, why? He described every blow, every moment. He didn't hold back. His testimony was cold, clinical, emotionless, like he was describing a car repair, not a murder. Like Teresa Sivers had been a problem to solve, not a human being with 2 daughters who loved her. Jimmy Ray Rogers went to trial in October 2019. He didn't testify in his own defense. He sat silently as prosecutors laid out the evidence, the GPS data, the Walmart footage, the blue jumpsuit, Taylor Shawmaker's testimony, Curtis Wright's confession. The jury deliberated for just a few hours. They found him guilty of second-degree murder. Judge Bruce Kyle, who'd seen thousands of cases over his career, called it one of the most horrific crimes he'd ever tried. Jimmy Ray Rogers was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Mark Sivers went to trial in December 2019. He sat at the defense table wearing a suit, clean-shaven, looking nothing like the man who'd ordered his wife's brutal murder. His lawyers argued that Curtis Wayne Wright was lying, that Curtis had killed Teresa out of jealousy because he was obsessed with Mark, that this was a crime of passion, not a murder for hire. The jury didn't buy it. Curtis testified against Mark, describing in detail how Mark had planned everything. Prosecutors presented the life insurance policies, the GPS data, the timeline that showed Mark had deliberately stayed out of town while the murder took place. They showed that Mark had given Curtis the security code to the house, that he told Curtis exactly when Teresa would be home alone. The evidence was overwhelming. On December 4th, 2019, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Mark Sivers guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The penalty phase began immediately. Should Mark Sivers receive life in prison or death? Teresa's family took the stand. Her mother, Mary Ann, spoke directly to Mark. "We will miss her every day for the rest of our lives," she said, her voice breaking. "You took her from us. You took her from her daughters." Mark's lawyers argued for life in prison. They said Josephine and Carmela had already lost their mother. Did they need to lose their father too? The girls had written letters asking the court for mercy. But prosecutors argued that Mark had shown no mercy to Teresa, that he'd orchestrated her murder with cold calculation, that he'd stood at her funeral and hugged her grieving family while knowing exactly what he'd done. The jury recommended death. On January 3rd, 2020, Judge Bruce Kyle sentenced Mark Sivers to death by lethal injection. For the conspiracy charge, he received an additional 30 years to be served concurrently. Mark stood as the sentence was read. He showed no emotion. He maintained his innocence throughout the entire trial, and even now, facing death row, he didn't waver. "I am grateful that the court can only determine my fate on earth," he said, "while my soul is in God's hands." He was taken to Union Correctional Institution in Ryford, Florida, to await execution. Josephine and Carmela Sivers were 11 and 8 years old when their mother was murdered. They were 12 and 9 when their father was arrested. By the time Mark's trial ended and he was sentenced to death, they were teenagers trying to navigate a world that had been shattered beyond recognition. Their grandmother, Mary Ann Groves, became their legal guardian. She'd already lost her daughter. Now she had to raise 2 traumatized girls who lost both parents in the most devastating way possible. Not to an accident, not to illness, but to deliberate, calculated violence orchestrated by the man who was supposed to protect them. Mary Ann rarely speaks publicly about the girls. When she does, she's careful to protect their privacy. But in statements to the court and in occasional interviews, she's made it clear that Josephine and Carmela carry deep emotional and psychological scars. They know their father ordered their mother's death. They know he showed no remorse. And yet, he's still their father. That's a burden no child should ever have to carry. The girls wrote letters to the court asking for mercy during Mark's sentencing. They didn't want him to receive the death penalty, not because they'd forgiven him, not because they believed he was innocent, but because losing one parent to murder and another to execution felt like too much loss to bear. The court didn't grant their request. Mark Sivers remains on death row at Union Correctional Institution in Ryford, Florida. As of 2026, he's filed multiple appeals, all of which have been denied. The Florida Supreme Court upheld both his conviction and his death sentence. Barring a successful future appeal or a change in Florida's death penalty laws, Mark Sivers will eventually be executed for the murder of his wife. Curtis Wainwright is serving his 25-year sentence at a medium security prison in Florida. Under the terms of his plea agreement, he won't be eligible for parole until he's served at least 85% of his sentence. That means he'll likely be in his 70s before he's released. His testimony against Mark saved him from death row, but it didn't save him from spending most of his remaining life behind bars. Jimmy Ray Rogers will die in prison. His life sentence without parole means exactly what it says. There is no possibility of release, no chance of redemption. He'll spend the rest of his life in a cell, remembered only as the Hammer, the man who helped murder a doctor for money. The Restorative Health and Healing Center, the holistic medical practice Teresa built from the ground up, closed permanently after her death. The building still stands in Estero, Florida, but it houses a different business now. Teresa's patients scattered, finding new doctors, new practitioners, searching for someone who could fill the void she left behind. Many of them say they never found anyone quite like her. Sandra Hoskins, Teresa's assistant who'd been waiting for her that Monday morning, eventually found work elsewhere. She'd been through her own hell during the investigation, briefly considered a suspect, questioned repeatedly, forced to relive the worst day of her professional life over and over. She rarely speaks about Teresa publicly now. The grief is still too raw. In 2020, the case gained renewed attention when A&E's Killer Cases aired an episode titled The Doctor is Dead. Before that, in 2019, CBS's 48 Hours produced a documentary called 1100 Miles to Murder. The coverage brought national attention to Teresa's story, but it also brought something else: speculation, conspiracy theories, and endless online debates about the case. Some people still believe Mark is innocent. They point to Curtis, writes criminal history, and argue that he framed Mark out of jealousy or obsession. These theories ignore the mountain of evidence: the GPS data, the life insurance policies, the security codes, the fact that Mark gave Curtis every piece of information needed to commit the murder. But conspiracy theories are comforting to some people. They prefer to believe in complex plots rather than accept the simple, horrible truth. A man murdered his wife for money and freedom. Teresa's sister, Annie Lisa, channeled her grief into writing. 10 years after Teresa's death, Annie published a book about her sister's life and legacy. She wanted the world to remember Teresa as more than just a murder victim, more than just a name in a true crime documentary. She wanted people to understand who Teresa really was: a brilliant doctor, a devoted mother, a woman who genuinely believed she could heal the world. I don't know why I had that thought, like, what's it going to feel like? Annie said in a 2025 interview, reflecting on the 10-year anniversary of Teresa's death. Because I just knew I was going to miss her more every day. That's the thing about grief. It doesn't get smaller over time. You just get bigger around it. You learn to carry it. You learn to function despite it, but it never really goes away. The case also raised broader questions about holistic medicine and the dangers practitioners face. In 2015, when Teresa was murdered, there had been 4 other holistic doctors who died under mysterious circumstances earlier that year. Some people believed there was a conspiracy, that someone or some organization was targeting alternative medicine practitioners. Investigators thoroughly examined that theory. They looked at each case individually, and what they found was that while all 5 doctors worked in holistic medicine, their deaths were unconnected. Each case had its own suspects, its own motives, its own tragic story. The only thing linking them was their profession and the timing. Sometimes coincidences are just coincidences, no matter how suspicious they appear. But the speculation did highlight a real issue. Holistic medicine practitioners often face skepticism, criticism, and even hostility from parts of the medical establishment. Teresa had dealt with that her entire career. She'd been dismissed, mocked, questioned, and she kept pushing forward, believing in what she was doing, refusing to compromise her vision. In some ways, that same determination, that refusal to back down, may have contributed to the problems in her marriage. Teresa was strong-willed, successful, independent. Mark couldn't control her. He couldn't dominate her. And when he realized she was slipping away from him, when he understood that he might lose not just his wife, but his lifestyle and his children, he made a choice that revealed exactly who he really was. He chose murder. Not passion, not accident, not a moment of rage, calculated, premeditated murder. He sat at Curtis Wright's wedding and calmly discussed killing the mother of his children. He provided the security codes, the timeline, the layout of the house. He stayed 1,000 miles away to establish an alibi. He stood at Teresa's funeral accepting condolences while knowing exactly what he'd done. That level of coldness is difficult to comprehend. Prosecutors who worked the case said they'd never seen anything quite like it. Sheriff Mike Scott, who'd overseen the investigation, said he wasn't sure Mark had blood in his veins. "I think he might have ice," Scott said. The case also exposed how modern technology has changed criminal investigations. 20 years ago, Curtis and Jimmy might have gotten away with murder, but in 2015 they left a digital trail they didn't even know existed. The GPS in their rental car, security cameras at Walmart, cell tower data, surveillance footage at airports and gas stations. Every movement recorded, logged, time-stamped. Curtis Wright was supposedly one of the smartest people with computers that his former classmates had ever met. But he didn't understand, or didn't care, that the technology he trusted was also the technology that would destroy him. Prosecutor Cynthia Ross called it a case in which 21st century technology became vital. Without that GPS data, without those surveillance cameras, Mark Sivers might still be a free man. Teresa's murder might still be unsolved. But justice did come, slowly, painfully, incompletely, but it came. Justice doesn't bring Teresa back. It doesn't erase the trauma her daughters carry. It doesn't heal the wound her mother lives with every single day. But it does mean that Mark Sivers, Curtis Wayne Wright, and Jimmy Ray Rogers will all face consequences for what they did. Mark will likely die in prison, either from natural causes while waiting on death row or by execution. Curtis will be elderly before he sees freedom again. Jimmy will never leave prison alive. And Teresa is buried in Connecticut near where she grew up. Her grave is marked with flowers that people still leave, even years later. Former patients, friends, people who never met her but were moved by her story. She'd wanted to change the world. She'd wanted to help people heal. She'd wanted to bring holistic medicine to the masses, to have her own television show, to make a difference on a scale that went beyond her small practice in Florida. She didn't get to do any of that. She got 17 blows from a hammer in her own kitchen while her daughters were 1,000 miles away. But in death, Teresa Sivers became something she never intended to be, a symbol, a reminder that evil can hide behind familiar faces, that the person you trust most might be the person planning your destruction, that appearances can be deceiving, and that monsters don't always look like monsters. Her story has been told in documentaries, podcasts, books, and articles. Millions of people know her name now. They know what happened to her. They know who killed her and why. That's not the legacy she wanted. She wanted to be remembered as a healer, not a victim. But maybe there's something valuable in her story anyway. Maybe it reminds people to pay attention, to trust their instincts, to recognize warning signs in relationships before it's too late. Maybe it saves someone else's life. Or maybe it just makes people sad. Maybe it's just another reminder that bad things happen to good people, and that sometimes there's no deeper meaning, no lesson to learn, no silver lining to grasp. Sometimes a tragedy is just a tragedy. Teresa's daughters are young women now, or nearly so. Their building lives away from the spotlight, away from the media attention, away from the constant reminders of what happened to their mother. Mary Ann has fought fiercely to protect their privacy, to give them a chance at normal lives despite the extraordinary circumstances. They'll carry their mother's memory forever. They'll also carry the knowledge of what their father did. That's a burden that will shape them for the rest of their lives, no matter how much therapy or time or distance they get. On June 28th each year, when the anniversary comes around, people in Bonita Springs remember Teresa. Some visit her old clinic building. Some post tributes on social media. Some just pause for a moment and think about the doctor who wanted to heal the world and was murdered by the man who promised to love her. 10 years have passed, then 11. The case fades from headlines. New tragedies take its place. That's how it works. The world moves on. But for Josephine and Carmela, for Mary Ann, for Teresa's sister and friends and patients, the world hasn't moved on. The loss is still there, present, real, a hole that can never be filled. Her name was Teresa and Grace Tottenham Sivers. She was 46 years old when she died. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother, a doctor, a friend. She believed in healing. She believed in helping people. She believed in love. She deserved more time. She deserved to watch her daughters grow up. She deserved to achieve her dreams and live the life she'd worked so hard to build. The world is less bright without her in it.